Wait a minute, get it how you live it. 10 toes in when we standing on business. I'm a big stepper, underground method.
Bennet Best Character.
BBC Tips. BBC Tips. What tier is Hu Tao in 2024? Is she still worth using? And what is the history of Hu Tao? These are all questions that have been asked constantly in the BBC community and the BWC community. And today, I have decided to analyze and ejaculate the rise, fall, and decay of Hu Tao in the Genshin Impact meta. So here's the history. 1.3, aka the First Lantern Ride, was the release of 3 major banners. Xiao, Keqing, and a character people are not sure if is actually coming out. Because back in the early days of Genshin, there were a lot of questionable leaks, such as Ayaka is free at AR42, the Chasm is coming out in 1.4, and the existence of Hu Tao. Unlike any other character in the Genshin Impact space, up to that point, Hu Tao had something special. Something that elevated her release back in March 2nd, 2021. Hu Tao had the worst player base I have ever seen for a character in all 12 of my years as a BBC reporter. Hu Tao immediately exploded into the stratosphere of the Genshin Impact meta with vernacular team comps, such as Hu Tao, Zijun, Albedo, and Zhongli. This was called Double Geo Hu Tao and was her most popular team comp up to that point. And of course, who could forget the centralizing team of Hu Tao, Pikachu, Sucrose, and Allergy Amber? You're probably thinking to yourself, BBC Tips, what are those dogshit teams? Are you seriously telling me Theory Crafters played Hu Tao, Xingqius, Sucrose, and Allergy Amber and thought it was a good team? Yes, my BBC tipster, back in the day, Theory Crafters, such as JStern27, considered 40k DPS to be very, very strong. And this actually goes again to my point of Child International being Neuvillette's closest competition, but that deserves its own video. BBC Tips, were the other teams back in the day any better than Double Geo Hu Tao, alongside Amber, Xingqiu77, and Sucrose? My BBC tipster let me introduce you to what were considered good teams back in the day, some behemoths of power, which include Child International, which is considered to be the best team in the Omniverse, and is still the best team in the game. Child International has never fallen off and will never fall off. It's impossible to counter. It has AoE, single target, front load, sustain. It can take care of shields. There will never, ever be a stronger team than Child International, which was considerably better than Hu Tao up to that point. Ganyu, back in the ancient days of 1.3, was considered very powerful because of her performance in teams like Morgana, which is the only team that can clear floor 9 in under 2 minutes. And you can even see speedrunners still play Ganyu today. And on that note, I would like to shout out my favorite Ganyu speedrunner. Please make sure to check out Foster or at LOLFXter on YouTube for exhilarating Ganyu speedruns. So what I would have personally concluded was that Ganyu was just as strong as Hu Tao back in the day. And who can forget the 30k DPS GOAT, Double Geo Xiao? Personally speaking, I believe that pre-Farzan Xiao was a social experiment to see what people will defend as long as it has AoE damage. Pre-Farzan Xiao could not burst, had a crippling energy issues, and did around half of a Hu Tao charged attack on every plunge, but hey, it's AoE, so he was still considered a good by the majority of Theory Crafters back in the day. Overall, I think Hu Tao was stronger than Xiao Cripple. During the early days of the meta, Hu Tao has established a name for herself as the single target ceiling of the game, and even became part of the Liyue Big 3, which consisted of Hu Tao, Ganyu, and Xiao. And everything changed during Inazuma. Besides Kazuha as a teammate, Hu Tao did not get any better until the release of Yelan, but the competition in Inazuma was so fucking ass that she was still considered top tier. Inazuma DPSs included such characters as Raiden Shogun, which her C2 was getting comparable clear times to Child International and C0. Ayaka, which is the worst DPS in the game. There will never ever be a worse DPS than Ayaka. She is terrible. I don't even joke, she is just bad. Kamisato Ayato, who needed his C6 to deal the same amount of damage as a C0 Child burst. while being unable to properly drive Xiangling or to get Hydro Swirl after the first rotation. Arasaki Ito, who was just okay. I guess he was shell but better. He still had energy issues, he still had no single target damage, but hey, at least he had constellations that worked single target. And everything changed when Yelan came out. You see, my BBC tipster, Hu Tao was beginning to struggle with the weight of Chiu Chiu. Her single target was not enough anymore. She was getting mocked constantly, and it was beginning to fall out of favor until Yelan came out. But BBC tips, isn't Yelan worse than Xingqiu? You see, my BBC tipster, Yelan allowed something that no other character at that point could allow Hu Tao. She did the damage for her. Yelan Laping her elemental skill dealt 5 times the damage of Hu Tao's charged attack, and it was enough to keep any AoE content in check and allowed her to stay at the top of the meta at that point. With her new best-in-slot team, Hu Tao VV Vape including Yelan, allowed her to keep up with the best throughout Inazuma and Sumeru, but some glazers, such as Jstern27, claimed Hu Tao was doing all the heavy lifting in the team, when in reality, Yelan was doing more than 50% of the work. And then Fontaine happened. This is what we will call the start of the meteoric fall of Hu Tao, my BBC tipster. Fontaine opened with the release of the GC Sin King. Unfortunately, no one cares, or will ever care about Linny, so whether he was stronger or weaker than Hu Tao was irrelevant because no one cared enough to actually play him. But then everything changed when Neuvillette came out. You see, my BBC tipster, Neuvillette and Hu Tao have more in common than you think. They both needed their C1, and the majority of their damage in their teams consists of Hydro. Not only that, Neuvillette basically did the same single target damage as Hu Tao's full team, but he did not need Vape, and he also had the ability to deal damage in AoE and at range. And you're probably thinking to yourself, BBC tips, what about Furina's addition to Hu Tao teams? Surely Furina's addition to Hu Tao teams allowed her to compete with the best of Fontaine, right? And BBC tips, what about plunge Hu Tao? Don't worry, my BBC enthusiasts, I am getting to that. Furina's addition to the game created a new core, which consisted of Furina, Yelan, and Bennet, or sometimes Jean. Furina's addition has created a core that I would like to refer to as Wheelchair Hypercarry, which is praised as one of the new best teams in the game. And you are probably thinking to yourself, but BBC tips, why does every Hu Tao speedrun use Furina, Yelan, Kazuha with Hu Tao instead of Jean or Bennet? You see, my child of BBC, Hu Tao players are all secretly in some sort of sunk cost fallacy, and they in fact own all of the following: C1 R1 Hu Tao, C3 or C6 Furina, C2 R1 Elegy Yelan or C6 Yelan, and C2 R1 Kazuha. This sunk cost fallacy of sort meant there is not a single player of Hu Tao that actually plays her at C0 and uses C0 supports with her, which allowed them to invalidate Furina's dogshit requirement of running a healer. This in turn allowed them to run Kazuha to buff Yelan and Furina's damage, further creating the team I will now dub as J-Star National. With the invention of J-Star National, Hu Tao was still being held in a somewhat high regard with a decently high perception, since no human on Earth played or cared about Linny. Thus, the competition for Pyro DPS was basically non-existent. But you see, my BBC tipsters, this all changed with the release of 3 new characters: Xian Yun, that boy Jingming, and of course Arlecchino. So let me get one thing very clear. That boy Xiaming is power creep. The release of Gaming was a negative towards Hu Tao because a 4-star DPS was objectively outdamaging her in single target, which was what she was good at. Gaming provided an alternative for single target Pyro carry that, unlike Yoimiya, was able to break the 50k DPS barrier. However, Hu Tao had one thing above that boy Jingo Ding. Because of Hu Tao's team consisting of Yelan and Furina, she was still easier to play than that boy Gaming, which led Hu Tao players to call the Prince of all GC simians unpractical, which led him to be dismissed by the general player base despite him objectively outdamaging Hu Tao on my Excel sheet. Besides the release of that boy Ba Xingming, the release of Shan Yun created a new archetype of plunge teams and pyro plungers. You see, my BBCs, Shan Yun is a character that allows every character in the game to plunge while buffing their damage, and providing AoE healing, which synergized very well with Furina. He uses comedically large plunge multiplier to become another single target pyro DPS that actually outdamages Hu Tao. And you're probably thinking to yourself, BBC tips, if Hu Tao can plunge too, wouldn't she be better than both Diluc and Gaming? Because of her use of Furina and Yelan, while still being able to plunge and deal comparable plunge damage? You see, my BBC tipster, this has created a rare condition called cyanosis. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, what the hell is cyanosis? Cyanosis is defined as the condition of having a team composed entirely of 5 stars who have comedically long burst animations that you essentially need to use to deal any sort of meaningful damage. So basically, Plunge Hu Tao not only takes 7 billion years to set up, her plunges are also much slower than both Gaming and Diluc, because polearms outside of Xiao just have inherently slower plunges than Claymore users, which simply led to Plunge Hu Tao having lower DPS than both Diluc and Gaming. And you're probably thinking to yourself, but BBC tips, what about Yelan's damage? Does that not factor towards better Hu Tao performance? The issue with that is, while Shan Yun's buff allowed Hu Tao to deal more personal damage, you also end up losing Yelan procs, because the N2C jump plunge combo provides less procs for Yelan than a simple N2C, and as we established earlier, Hu Tao does no damage, so losing Yelan procs is actually a negative, since in both a wheelchair hypercarry and J-Star National, Yelan's damage is far more important than Hu Tao's. Despite both of the pyro plungers outperforming Hu Tao, much like the GC Sim King himself, no one actually ended up caring, and the community wrote off pyro plungers as a gimmick despite them outperforming Hu Tao. Because of the nature of J-Star National and wheelchair hypercarry, Hu Tao was still in a relatively fine position for a while. But then, the end of an era. Arlecchino release sparked a change in the community. You see, my BBC tipster, Arlecchino herself was a direct upgrade to Hu Tao in every single way. She was easier to play, had better AoE, better constellations. There is simply not a single thing Hu Tao had over Arlecchino, since she was also able to run the exact same teams and outperform her. Free to play, she mocked her. Dolphin, she mocked her. Whale level, she mocked her. Hu Tao mains could not actually say, oh, Hu Tao is more practical. Oh, Hu Tao is better with C1R1, or any other sort of coping excuse, because no matter how many N2Cs, no matter how many times they go by swirled, they could no longer deny the truth. Hu Tao got mocked on every front, despite every indirect buff, despite every reach for a new character to buff her. They simply ran out of the stamina to cope. After 4 long years, Hu Tao has finally found a new home in the C tier. Make sure to like the video and comment how much you love the BBC. BBC tips out.